When I was a child, I was always known as somebody's daughter or somebody's little sister. So my brother and I, we look a lot alike. People always thought we were twins, even though he's 5 years older than I am. He was always like graduating from a school and I was entering that school the next year. So it was always, I would always get lots of questions from teachers and students, oh, you must be David's little sister. I always hated all of those questions. It's like I never had my own identity. I was always somebody in regards to somebody else. But when I went off to college, nobody knew my family. They all only knew me. And so that was a time where I just felt like I really got to establish my identity. And so that was just a really fun time. And then when Robert and we met in college, we got married right after college. And then when he started pastoring, I became the preacher's wife. And all of a sudden, there went Lisa again. I didn't have much of an identity. I just became the preacher's wife. In one of the small towns that we lived in, there were a lot of people that did not know my name at all. They only knew that I was the preacher's wife. One day I was talking to this sweet lady in that town. Her name's Miss Peggy, and she and her husband owned the pest service company in the town. It was a local pest service, and she and I were talking about this same subject, and I said, I don't even get a name. I'm just the preacher's wife. And she said, Lisa, just count your blessings because you could be the bug man's wife. And so we just had a great big laugh from that, and it just brought things into total perspective for me. So anyway, today in our lesson, we're going to see David entering into Saul's court. And you're going to find how David, even from a very young age, had already established a name for himself. Now, it's not necessarily who he was known by, but the things that he was known for. And I want you to really pick up on those characteristics because I want you to see that even though he was really young, he had already established these really strong characteristics that other people had noticed in him. And that's something that all of us need to learn. So let's dive into the lesson and see what we're going to find out about David this week.
So as we start David part 2, let's go back to David part 1 and kind of do a quick recap. So 1 Samuel chapter 16 actually opens up with the Lord talking to Samuel, and he says, "How long will you grieve over Saul, since I've rejected him over being king over Israel? Fill your horn with oil and go. I will send you to Jesse the Bethlehemite, for I have selected a king for myself among his sons." So if you remember, Saul, throughout all of his kingship, Saul rejected all of the ways of God and wanted to do things his own way. And so God finally, he just says, I'm going to replace Saul. And so Samuel is being sent to Jesse, and that's exactly what he does. He goes to Jesse, and if you remember, all of Jesse's sons are brought before him. And of course, Samuel is looking at all of Jesse's sons, and he chooses, and he thinks that surely one of these older sons is the next king. And one by one, God says, nope, that's not it. That's not him. That's not him. That's not the one I've chosen. And finally, then we get to the last son that was brought before him. And when this last son is brought before him, we see this little David that is brought in from tending the sheep out in the fields. And sure enough, when he walks in, God says, yep, that is the next king. You anoint him. And so Samuel anoints David right there in front of all of his brothers and in front of his father. They know that David has been chosen to do something by God. They don't know what yet. They just know that David has been anointed to do something special from God. So, the key theme here from David part 1 is that God is emphasizing that even though man looks at the outside, God looks at the heart. You know, David was the least likely of all of Jesse's sons to be chosen for the next king. But yet God looked at his heart and he saw this young shepherd boy and he saw in him a heart that served him. And so he was the one that God knew was going to be the next king. He knew that he was going to be the next one that would lead his people and serve him. And that is what brings us into David part 2. As we continue in 1 Samuel chapter 16, we're going to now see how David is going to enter into Saul's court. So we come across into verse 14, where it says, "Now the Spirit of the Lord departed from Saul, and an evil spirit from the Lord terrorized him." Now we're going to camp out on this verse for a few minutes, but first I want you to kind of picture King Saul with an evil spirit of the Lord terrorizing him. And I want you to kind of imagine what maybe that looked like.
Ah! 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 Why? Why?
So I know that was pretty drastic, but you really have to think about that this was an evil spirit from the Lord that was terrorizing King Saul. So it was drastic. And you can imagine that King Saul here, he had to have been miserable, and rightly so. He chose over and over and over again to disobey the ways of God. So I want to take a look a little bit more at this verse. So the first part of this verse, I know that can sometimes bother some people because how we read it, where it says, "Now the Spirit of the Lord departed from Saul." And I know that can trouble some people because you really don't often think about the Spirit of the Lord departing from someone. So I wanted to just go back and kind of look a little bit back of how God actually came to Saul to begin with. So I went back to 1 Samuel chapter 10, verse 9, and this is when Saul actually came into knowing and meeting God to begin with for the first time. And it says that then it happened when he, and that he is Saul, turned back to leave Samuel, that God changed his heart. Okay, so now when you see that God changed his heart, that means that God did not necessarily give him a regenerated heart, like you would think that God gives a new Christian a new heart. God actually gave him a ruler's heart because God had given him and anointed him to be the king. And so God gave him the heart of a king. He appointed Saul to be the king of his people. Now, God does not force himself on anyone. He wants everyone to come to him on their own. And so this was no different than with Saul. Saul had the opportunity to come to God over and over and over again, and over and over and over again. He chose not to. He chose to disobey the ways of God. And that is why we have that the Spirit of God was departing from Saul. So now we have the second part of this verse, which also troubles some people whenever you see that an evil spirit from the Lord terrorized him. And sometimes it's hard for us to imagine that God does sometimes he can use the evil ways to accomplish his will. And so it's not known here of whether this evil spirit was to try to bring Saul to repentance, or was it to bring him to judgment? So we're not sure in which case, but either way, this is just a very strong reminder to all of us that God is in control of all things, even the spirits and all of the evil. God is in control of all of it. And we see that time and time again in the Bible, you see it in the book of Job. And so it's just evident right here as well. Okay, so let's move on. So now some of Saul's advisors are coming to him. They're really worried about him because of how he's acting. And you rightly so, if you remember that earlier video. So in verse 16, we read that one of Saul's advisors comes and says, let our Lord now command your servants who are before you. Let them seek a man who is a skillful player on the harp, and it shall come about when the evil spirit from God is on you, that he shall play the harp with his hand, and you will be well. During that time, the people believed very strongly that music was just very therapeutic to the soul, and it still is today. But especially the harp, that was just one of the most favored musical instruments of that time. And so Saul thought, "Yep, that is a great idea. I want you to go and find someone like just exactly what you said." And finally, here is where we see David. So in 1 Samuel chapter 16, verse 18, one of the young men one of the advisors said, "Behold, I have seen a son of Jesse, the Bethlehemite, who is a skillful musician, a mighty man of valor, a warrior, one prudent in speech, and a handsome man, and the Lord is with him." Okay, guys. David, at this point, he's a teenager. It's estimated that he's probably between like 15 and 18 years old at this time. Look at how he is being described. He is not only a skillful musician, he's good looking, but he is a man of valor. He is a warrior. He is prudent in speech. That means he is just known to have a very good way in his speaking. But the most important thing is that last phrase, the Lord is with him. And do you know how many of us, I just wish that even at my age, these things could be said of me, even now at my age. And to have all of these things being said at such a young age, that is something that I think we should all attain for, because he had made a name for himself even at such a young age. God was with him, and it wasn't just that he knew that, David himself, everybody else knew that as well, and that was amazing. So Saul sends word to Jesse, and he asks Jesse to send David to be in his court, and that's exactly what happens. David ends up coming, and David becomes his armor bearer, but David also is the one who ends up calming his nerves down whenever he's having these fits. So let's take a look and see how that kind of played out.
Ah! 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 Why? Why?
So this is how we see that little David gets introduced into Saul's court. And it turns out to be a really good start. Saul, in verse 21, it says that Saul loved David. And so we're going to really see how God continues to use David in a mighty way. So things are about to get very, very interesting in the next few parts. I want to say a special thanks to Grady Taylor, Drew Smith and Abby Lassiter for their contribution to this video of David Part 2. And we are now casting for David Part 3, which is going to be the epic episode of David and Goliath. So if you are interested in being in the next video, be sure to reach out to me and let me know that you're interested. I would love to have you be a part. Thanks, and I hope that you enjoyed David Part 2. See you next time.